By 1980, the muscle car era that once ruled the streets had been neutered by federal regulations, emission standards, soaring insurance costs, and the aftermath of the 1973 and 1979 oil crises. The result? A sad parade of muscle cars that looked tough but had hearts of oatmeal. These were the last gasps, some flashy, some desperate, of American automakers trying to hold on to a dying breed. Here are 8 so-called super muscle cars from 1980 that helped make muscle disappear, not with a bang, but a wheeze.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 8, the 1980 Pontiac Trans Am Turbo. A car that marked both a dramatic pivot from raw muscle to forced induction and the beginning of the end for the Golden Age Firebird era. Today, we're examining a car that embodies the strange, aspirational, and ultimately disappointing spirit of muscle cars at the dawn of the 1980s. The 1980 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Turbo. This wasn't just another Trans Am. This was Pontiac's attempt to save face and speed in the face of crushing emission standards, rising gas prices, and disappearing horsepower. In place of the beloved 400 and 455 V8s, Pontiac gave us something different. A turbocharged 301 cubic inch V8. It looked fast. It was in movies. It had decals the size of pizza ovens. But under the hood, not quite what fans expected. Let's rewind to 1980. By this point, the American muscle car was a shadow of its former self. The 1970s had not been kind. The Clean Air Act had crippled high-performance engines. Unleaded fuel requirements ended the era of high compression. Insurance premiums skyrocketed for sporty models. Corporate average fuel economy, CAFE, standards pushed manufacturers to reduce displacement and boost efficiency. And the 1979 energy crisis reignited gas price fears. Pontiac, once a leader in muscle with the GTO and the early Trans Am, had a choice: fade away with its big blocks, or try to reinvent performance with new technology. Their solution? Turbocharging. In 1979, Pontiac finally retired its big 6.6L 400 SID V8. There were no more massive displacement engines left in the stable. Enter the 301 Turbo, Pontiac's attempt to salvage performance with a smaller forced induction motor. 301 cubic inches 4.9L turbocharged V8, single Garrett TB305 turbocharger, 4-barrel carburetor, draw-through setup, compression ratio 7.6 to 1, rated at 210 horsepower and 345 pound-foot of torque. On paper, it seemed promising. It produced more torque than the outgoing 400 and was lighter. But on the street, it fell flat. At 60 miles per hour, around 9.0 seconds, quarter mile, around 16 seconds, no manual transmission option, only a 3-speed automatic. Not exactly earth-shattering. Despite the turbo, the Trans Am had gained weight and the power delivery was inconsistent. Turbo lag was significant and the carbureted system struggled with heat soak and reliability. What the 1980 turbo Trans Am lacked in performance, it made up for in style and presence. Giant turbo boost lights in the hood scoop, non-functional but dramatic. Massive Firebird hood decal, optionally turbo wheels, available WS6 suspension package, upgraded sway bars and tires, turbo badging everywhere from fenders to tail. It was loud, bold, and unmistakably 1980s. And thanks to the ongoing success of Smokey and the Bandit, let's get technical. Why didn't the 301 Turbo succeed? Carbureted setup. Unlike modern EFI turbo engines, this system used a draw-through carburetor, which placed the carb before the turbo. This led to poor fuel atomization, fuel puddling, and heat soak problems. No intercooler, which meant high intake temps and detonation risk. Low compression plus lag. 7.6 to 1 compression ratio helped avoid knocking, but robbed off boost power. Turbo lag was bad enough that the car felt slow off the line unless pushed hard. No manual transmission. The 301 Turbo was only offered with an automatic, which dulled the driving experience even more. Reliability concerns. The engine was not built from the ground up for turbocharging. Cooling and oiling systems weren't robust enough for long-term boost. Pontiac tried to sell it as high-tech performance, but most buyers who actually wanted speed felt disappointed. It was all show, no go. Despite the issues, the 1980 Trans Am Turbo did sell decently, mostly on styling and name recognition. Over 50,000 Trans Ams were sold in 1980. The turbo package was standard on the pace car edition that year. The 1980 Indy 500 pace car was a white and silver turbo TA. It looked amazing but struggled under testing. By 1981, Pontiac gave the turbo another try, adding electronic spark control, a knock sensor, and other refinements. But it was too little, too late. Performance was still underwhelming. By 1982, the third-generation Firebird debuted with entirely new styling and smaller engines. The 301 Turbo was gone, never to return. Number 7. The 1980 Chevrolet Camaro Z28, a muscle car trying to survive in an era that was actively working against everything it stood for. Today, we're diving into one of the most stylistically aggressive yet mechanically subdued American performance cars of its era, the 1980 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. By 1980, the Camaro was no longer the brash pony car of its 1960s debut. Instead, it was an aging platform dressed in decals and scoops, still trying to sell the illusion of speed in a decade where speed was under siege. Let's explore how the 1980 Z28 served as a rolling contradiction, a fast-looking car in a slow-moving era. The early 1980s were not kind to muscle cars. The industry faced a perfect storm: stricter emissions regulations imposed by the EPA. Unleaded fuel requirements killed high-compression engines. Gas shortages and rising fuel costs led to shrinking engines. Soaring insurance rates punished young buyers of performance vehicles. Corporate average fuel economy, CAFE standards made small cars a necessity. By 1980, most muscle cars were either dead or wearing cosmetic packages to pretend they were still alive. Chevrolet's answer? Keep the Camaro Z28 alive, but under a very different philosophy than it started with. Chevrolet knew that buyers still wanted the image of a muscle car, even if they couldn't get the horsepower. So the 1980 Camaro Z28 was designed to look fast, whether or not it actually was. The Z28 still wore bold stripes, custom tritone graphics, and a functional hood scoop with flapper door. Aggressive front air dam and rear spoiler added flair. Fender vents, body-colored wheels, and Z28 callouts made sure no one mistook it for a base model. It was one of the most visually dramatic cars on the road, especially in bright hues like red, silver, or black with gold stripes. But looks only went so far. Now for the sobering truth. The 1980 Camaro Z28 had all the swagger of a street fighter with the punch of a middleweight. The standard Z28 engine in 1980 was a 350 cubic inch 5.7-liter V8. Output, a meager 190 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque. You could get it with a 3-speed automatic or a 4-speed manual. The optional California spec engine was even worse, 305 V8 with only 155 horsepower. Keep in mind, this was the performance Camaro. 0-60 miles per hour in about 9 seconds, quarter mile, 16.5 seconds. For context, the 1970 Z28 had made 360 horsepower and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. The 1980 version could barely outrun a station wagon from the previous decade. Despite the numbers, the Z28 still held cultural cachet. It was a favorite among young buyers who wanted affordable performance looks, NASCAR fans. Camaro was still a fixture on speedways, customizers who cared more about image than time slips. But among enthusiasts, the Z28's decline was painfully obvious. It had become more touring car than terror. By 1980, the second-generation Camaro, launched in 1970, was entering its final years. The design was now 10 years old, and while Chevrolet had continued to refresh its looks, the underlying tech was aging badly. The Chevrolet Corvette, which at least still offered modest power, Japanese imports which were smaller, more efficient, and more reliable, compact coupes like the Mustang, which itself was downsized and neutered, Chevy knew it needed a reboot. The next generation Camaro was on the drawing board, but until then they had to ride out the Z28's awkward decline. The 1980 Z28 is often remembered more for what it represented than what it actually achieved. Kept the Camaro nameplate visible during a dark era, sold decently, Buyers still liked the look, maintained a cool factor thanks to its styling and pop culture presence, delivering real performance, living up to its own legacy, competing with rising foreign alternatives. The 1980 Z28 was a survivor, not a leader. It represented a muscle car trying to fake it in a world that no longer allowed it to make it. The 1980 Chevrolet Camaro Z28 was a car caught in a paradox. It wore the clothes of a performance icon, but underneath it had been declawed, detuned, and deflated. It looked like it could eat Corvettes for breakfast, but it struggled to beat a Volkswagen Rabbit. Number 6, the 1981 Ford Mustang Cobra, a car that looked fast, but marked the final whimper of the aging Mustang II lineage. Today's topic takes us to the low point of an American legend, the 1981 Ford Mustang Cobra. This was a car that should have represented street dominance. After all, it wore the Cobra name, which conjures images of Carroll Shelby, Le Mans glory, and big block firepower. But the 1981 Mustang Cobra wasn't a predator. It was the last breath of a struggling, neutered muscle car, one desperately trying to look relevant while being built on outdated bones and forced to comply with increasingly restrictive emission standards. Let's unpack how Ford got here and why this particular Cobra became little more than a stickered swan song. By the early 1970s, the muscle car era was gasping for air. The Clean Air Act demanded lower emissions. Insurance premiums for performance cars soared. Gas prices skyrocketed with the 1973 oil crisis, and safety regulations added weight and complexity. In response, Ford released the Mustang II in 1974, a smaller, Pinto-based pony car meant to reflect the changing market. It sold well initially due to its size and economy, but it was widely criticized by enthusiasts for being underpowered and uninspiring. By 1979, the Fox body Mustang replaced the Mustang II. It had a longer wheelbase, more room for improvements, and better styling. But in 1981, it was still transitioning from Malaise-era mediocrity. Which brings us to the 1981 Mustang Cobra. Let's be honest, when you slap the name Cobra on a Mustang, people expect firepower. But the 1981 Cobra was built during the darkest time for performance cars, when horsepower ratings were lower than some modern-day minivans. Engine: 4.2-liter, 255 cu and V8. Horsepower: 119 horsepower. Torque: around 194 pound-feet. Transmission: 3-speed automatic only, no manual option. Yes, you heard that right, 119 horsepower, in a Cobra. In fact, this was the lowest output V8 ever put in a Cobra-branded Mustang. There was also a turbocharged 2.3-liter 4-cylinder option, making 132 horsepower, but it suffered from reliability issues and was less powerful than it sounded on paper. To compensate for the lack of performance, Ford leaned hard into graphics and appearance packages. Blacked-out trim, fall hood scoop, though mostly decorative, bold Cobra decals and coiled snake graphics, lower front air dam, rear spoiler. It looked fast, until you pressed a gas pedal, and that was the tragedy of this Mustang. It screamed performance but whispered on the street. The interior of the 1981 Cobra didn't offer much in the way of excitement. Basic vinyl seats, with optional Recaro buckets, gauges were minimal, plastic trim felt dated, manual windows and locks were still common. Buyers expecting a true performance cockpit found something more akin to an economy coupe with racing stripes. It's easy to mock the 1981 Mustang Cobra for its gutless V8 and over-the-top graphics, but to understand it is to understand why the muscle car had to change, and eventually would. The end of the all-show, no-go muscle car era, Ford's final flirtation with a nameplate it couldn't support, a placeholder before real performance returned in the Fox body Mustangs of 1982 and beyond. That next year, Ford would launch the 1982 Mustang GT, bringing back a high-output 5.0-liter V8 and restoring the Mustang's performance credibility. But the 1981 Cobra had to stumble so the 1982 GT could run. Today, the 1981 Mustang Cobra is rare but not highly sought after, remembered more for its decals than performance, a symbol of the Malaise era's rock bottom. Yet it holds a certain nostalgic appeal. To some collectors, it's a curious time capsule, a what were they thinking model that perfectly captures the weird transitional energy of the early 80s. In many ways, it's a Mustang worth remembering not for what it did, but what it couldn't do. The 1981 Ford Mustang Cobra was a car built in an era that wouldn't allow muscle cars to be muscle cars. It tried to keep the fire alive through paint, plastic, and memories of better days. Number 5, the 1983 Mercury Capri RS, an often overlooked fox body performance car that lived in the long shadow of the Mustang. Today we explore a curious and often neglected branch of the American muscle car family tree. The 1983 Mercury Capri RS. This car shared bones, muscle, and attitude with the 1983 Mustang GT. But while the Mustang became an icon of the fox body generation, the Capri RS never quite caught on. It was fast, distinctive, and genuinely cool. But it suffered from an identity crisis and poor brand alignment. By the time the decade closed, Mercury's pony car quietly exited the stage, unloved, but not without merit. Let's examine what made the Capri RS a worthy performer and why it ultimately faded into obscurity. By the late 1970s, muscle cars had been choked by emissions regulations, soaring insurance premiums, and shrinking power output. But in 1979, Ford introduced the Fox platform, a lightweight, versatile chassis that became the new home for the Mustang and its Mercury twin, the Capri. While the Mustang GT began its slow climb back to performance credibility, Mercury sought to give its own version a sporty twist. Thus, the Capri RS was born. The RS Rally Sport designation promised more than just flashy looks. In 1983, it became Mercury's muscle machine, a performance car with its own identity. At least that was the idea. While based on the fox body Mustang, the Capri RS had its own visual flavor. A bulging, rounded, bubble hatchback window, a Capri signature. Flared fenders for a wider, more aggressive stance. Unique front grille treatment. Prominent RS badging and blackout trim, optional two-tone paint. It looked meaner and more European than the Mustang. Part Mustang muscle, part rally car flair. But despite its eye-catching styling, it lived in a strange no-man's land between Ford's muscle identity and Mercury's luxury image. The 1983 Capri RS was no poser. It backed up its looks with real muscle, especially in V8 form. 5.0-liter high-output V8, 302 cu-inches. Output, 175 horsepower and 245 lb-ft torque. Carbureted 4-barrel setup. FT 5-speed manual transmission. This was the same engine found in the 1983 Mustang GT, delivering brisk acceleration and a throaty exhaust note that signaled the return of real performance to American cars. Other available engines included the 2.3-liter inline-4, 3.3-liter inline-6, 3.8-liter V6, but the RS was all about the 5.0 V8. That's where the performance story lived. With a relatively light curb weight and solid rear axle, the Capri RS could hold its own against Camaros and Firebirds, especially when paired with manual gears and aggressive gearing. The Capri RS wasn't just fast in a straight line, it handled respectably for its time. Thanks to a McPherson strut front suspension, stiffer springs and shocks on the RS package. Here's where the Capri RS hits a wall. Despite sharing performance hardware with the Mustang GT, it never sold well. Why? Mercury had always been the upscale division of Ford, selling quiet, comfortable cruisers to middle-aged buyers. A muscle coupe fell out of place in Mercury showrooms next to Grand Marquis sedans. The Mustang had the name, the history, and the marketing. Why buy a Capri RS when you could get a Mustang GT with the same engine and more street cred? Ford threw its advertising muscle behind the Mustang. The Capri RS received very little marketing, and few buyers even knew it existed. Ford was essentially competing with itself, and the Mustang always won. The Capri RS would continue with minor updates through the mid-1980s. It got fuel injection in 1985. It briefly offered higher output variants like the 5.0 HO-EFI. But by 1986, the writing was on the wall. Mercury was moving away from performance, and the Capri quietly disappeared from the lineup in 1986. The Capri name would return later as a Mazda-built convertible in the early 90s. But the V8 RS muscle coupe was gone for good. Today, the 1983 Capri RS is rare. Far fewer were built than Mustangs. Affordable, It's one of the cheapest Fox-body V8 performance cars. Underappreciated but beloved by certain enthusiasts for its unique looks. Number 4, the 1984 Pontiac Fiero Indy Pace car. A vehicle that promised innovation but ultimately fell victim to its own compromises. Today, we turn our attention to a car that was hailed as a revolution when it launched, the 1984 Pontiac Fiero, specifically the Indy Pace Car Edition. With its space-age looks and mid-engine layout, the Fiero was supposed to signal a bold new era for American performance cars. Compact, sporty, efficient, and futuristic. The Indy Pace Car variant added even more flair, capitalizing on its honor as the official pace car of the 1984 Indianapolis 500. It came decked out in dramatic two-tone paint, wings, and special decals. It looked like a mini exotic, but under the fiberglass skin, the Fiero was burdened by budget constraints, corporate politics, and underwhelming hardware. The result? A promising concept that never reached its full potential and disappeared from Pontiac showrooms just a few years later. The Fiero was born during a period when GM needed to shift toward fuel economy, not just power. Pontiac engineers pitched it not as a sports car, but as a commuter car with flair. Still, its mid-engine layout, previously seen mostly in European exotics, caused massive buzz. Public expectations soared. People thought this was America's Ferrari. But here's the twist. The Fiero's design was hobbled by internal GM politics. Chevy didn't want it to outshine the Corvette. Pontiac had to reuse parts from GM's economy bins. Chevette suspension, Citation steering rack. Engine choices were limited. No V6 for the first model year. Despite that, Pontiac had already secured a major marketing win. The Fiero would pace the 1984 Indy 500. To celebrate its high-profile Indy 500 role, Pontiac created a limited edition Indy pace car replica based on the Fiero SE. Two-tone white and silver paint scheme, official pace car, graphics and striping, aero body kit with deeper front fascia and rear wing, special 16-inch wheels with Goodyear Eagle GT tires, custom gray and red interior with embroidered seats, individually numbered dash plaque, only 2,000 production units made. It looked aggressive, exotic, and futuristic. From a distance, you might think it was something Italian. Up close, well, let's talk about the mechanicals. Unfortunately, the most disappointing part of the 1984 Fiero Indy Pace car was its engine. 2.5-liter Iron Duke inline-4 outputs 92 horsepower to 60 miles per hour, 11 seconds. Transmission, 4-speed manual, or 3-speed automatic. That's right, a car that looked like it could fight a Ferrari had a noisy, coarse, pushrod 4-cylinder engine from an economy sedan. Despite having a mid-engine layout and rear-wheel drive, its performance was anemic. Handling was limited by archaic suspension geometry borrowed from front-wheel drive compacts. Braking? Marginal. There was a one-off V8-powered pace car built for the actual Indy 500. The 1984 Fiero, and especially the Indy Pace Car Edition, sold well at first. The unique looks, affordable price, and hype machine created a massive wave of enthusiasm. Pontiac sold over 136,000 Fieros in the first year alone, and the Indy model was considered a collector's item out of the gate. But buyers quickly learned the truth. It was hot and cramped inside. The engine was rough and slow. Reliability issues, including engine fires, plagued early models due to oil leaks and poor design. What began as excitement turned into consumer disappointment. The Fiero's reputation as a serious sports car took a serious hit. Over the next few years, Pontiac tried to make good. In 1985, the V6 engine became available, 140 horsepower, finally offering real performance. Suspension geometry was upgraded, interior and build quality slowly improved. But the damage had been done. The Indy Pace car had promised a halo image the car couldn't support. By 1988, just as the Fiero GT finally became a true performer, with a refined suspension and looks to match, GM canceled the model. Why? Declining sales, a bad reputation, and internal pressure to protect the Corvette. Today, the 1984 Pontiac Fiero Indy Pace car represents one of the few mid-engine American production cars of the 20th century, a symbol of GM's conflicting goals, innovation versus cost-cutting, a collector curiosity, especially in original, low-mileage condition. Number 3, the 1985 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS, a car that tried to revive American muscle spirit during a time of tightening regulations and rising import dominance. Today we dive into a machine that tried to recapture the spirit of American muscle at a time when that spirit was fading. The 1985 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS. With its NASCAR pedigree, aerodynamic styling, and performance branding, this mid-80s coupe carried the torch of Chevrolet's proud racing legacy. But under the surface, it was a mixed bag. While the Monte Carlo SS looked fast, with its aggressive front fascia, spoiler, and V8 badge, its performance was mild at best. Especially in an era when European and Japanese imports were offering turbocharging, fuel injection, and better build quality. Let's explore how the Monte Carlo SS came to be, why it excited enthusiasts, and ultimately, why it couldn't outrun the changing automotive landscape of the 1980s. To understand the 1985 Monte Carlo SS, we need to step back to the 1970s. By mid-decade, traditional muscle cars were effectively dead, killed off by stricter emissions regulations, rising insurance premiums, a gas crisis that made V8s impractical, and consumer interest shifting toward economy and efficiency. By the 1980s, GM's once mighty muscle lineup had either been neutered or discontinued entirely. But Chevrolet's presence in NASCAR was still very real and very important. In fact, the Monte Carlo had become a key NASCAR platform. And to compete on the oval, Chevrolet needed to homologate certain body features, like a sloped nose and spoiler, for use on production vehicles. Enter the Monte Carlo SS, a street version born to satisfy racing regulations and stir up some showroom excitement. The 1985 Monte Carlo SS was visually distinct from its regular Monte Carlo siblings. Aerodynamic front fascia with a deep, sloped nose. Rear deck lid spoiler, SS badging and striking striping. Sport mirrors and 15-inch rally wheels. Optionally T-tops for a classic muscle vibe. This car looked like it meant business, especially compared to the squared-off, soft coupes of the early 1980s. Inside, however, things were more traditional. A column or floor shifter, velour bucket seats, a somewhat dated dashboard layout, minimal driver engagement compared to modern performance cars. Still, compared to anything else GM was offering in 1985 with sporting pretensions, the Monte Carlo SS stood out. Here's where things get complicated. 5-boy 0-liter, 305 cu engine, high output, HO V8, output, 180 horsepower and 240 pound-feet of torque. Transmission, 4-speed automatic, TH200 4R, 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 8.4 seconds. Compared to the smog-choked V8s of just a few years earlier, the Monte Carlo SS felt relatively sprightly. It had decent low-end torque. Despite its flaws, the 1985 Monte Carlo SS sold well. Why? Because in a sea of forgettable GM A-bodies and dowdy sedans, the Monte Carlo SS offered personality. It was affordable, carried an aggressive visual presence, came from a brand buyers trusted, and had a clear connection to Chevrolet's NASCAR dominance. It filled a niche, buyers who remembered the muscle car era but couldn't afford a Corvette or didn't want to drive a compact Mustang, found the Monte Carlo SS to be a satisfying middle ground. Plus, Chevrolet was marketing it hard, showcasing the car in print ads and commercials that tied it directly to racing success. Still, the Monte Carlo SS couldn't escape the larger problems facing American performance in the 1980s. Emissions restrictions kept horsepower figures modest. Carburetors were still used in 1985, even as imports moved to electronic fuel injection. The platform itself, the G-body, was aging fast. It lacked the refinement, precision, and technology buyers were starting to expect. Worse yet, competition wasn't just from Japan. Even GM's own Camaro Z28 and Pontiac Trans Am offered better performance for similar money. Today, the 1985 Monte Carlo SS is fondly remembered for several reasons. It was part of the last rear-wheel drive midsize Chevys. Its NASCAR styling made it a collectible. It helped keep performance alive when most cars were going soft, and it paved the way for the legendary 1986-87 Aero Coupe, which improved aerodynamic efficiency even further. Number 2, the 1982 Buick Regal Grand National, a car that looked like a menace, but didn't fully live up to its promise, at least not yet. Today we're going to talk about the 1982 Buick Regal Grand National, a car that carried an iconic name and an unforgettable look, but not the muscle to match. While later Grand Nationals of the mid to late 80s would become legends in American performance, this first-year model was more about appearance than performance. So why did Buick launch a Grand National in the first place? Why was it so hyped, and why did it fall short of expectations? Let's dive in. To understand the 1982 Grand National, we have to appreciate where Buick was at the time. By the early 1980s, the muscle car era was long gone. Smog regulations, fuel crises, and insurance hikes had killed high-horsepower V8s by the mid-70s. GM divisions like Chevrolet and Pontiac were still struggling to find their performance footing. But Buick, of all brands, had begun to find success in a very different arena: NASCAR. Their Regal-bodied stock cars with slippery aerodynamics and strong V8s were winning races, and Buick wanted to capitalize on that success. So they came up with the idea: create a special edition Regal that celebrated their racing dominance. Thus was born the 1982 Buick Regal Grand National, named after the NASCAR Winston Cup Grand National Series. So what exactly was the 1982 Grand National? Let's start with the visuals, because those were arguably the most memorable part of this car. Two-tone charcoal gray and silver paint, not yet the all-black look of later GNs. Grand National badging with a checkered flag logo. Front and rear spoilers, unique turbine-style wheels, sporty interior trim with GN embroidery. It looked serious, it looked fast, it looked like a high-performance machine ready to dominate the streets. But then you checked under the hood. Performance options were all over the place, and that's where the 1982 GN fell apart. Most units came with a naturally aspirated 4.1-liter V6, making just 125 horsepower. That's not muscle, that's grandma's grocery getter in a black tuxedo. A few units were reportedly equipped with a turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 from the Regal Sport Coupe, but even that only made 175 horsepower and was rarely paired with aggressive gearing or suspension upgrades. Worse yet, only 215 units of the 1982 Grand National were built with the turbo engine. The majority were sluggish, more show than go. So despite the exterior bravado and the NASCAR connection, the first GN felt like a styling exercise, a clever marketing move, but not a performance milestone. Consumers were excited by the look, but quickly realized the car wasn't backing it up. Enthusiasts were disappointed, especially those who remembered the genuine performance cars of the 60s and early 70s. Still, the Grand National name stuck in people's minds. Buick had planted a seed, and in just a couple years, they would grow it into something radical. Today, the 1982 Grand National is a rare collectible, not because of its performance, but because of its historical importance. It represents the starting point of the Grand National lineage, Buick's tentative step into performance branding, a rare moment when a GM brand tested the waters before diving in. Certificates value it for its low production numbers, its distinct paint scheme, and its connection to Buick's evolution in the 1980s. In hindsight, it was less a performance car and more a promise, a declaration from Buick that it wasn't done yet. And that promise, Buick kept it. Just a few short years later, the Grand National would become the fastest American car you could buy. The 1982 Buick Regal Grand National is often misunderstood. Critics rightly call it underpowered, but they miss the point. This wasn't the Grand National we remember. It was the prelude. It was a case of marketing getting ahead of engineering, a stylish, bold experiment that told the world Buick was ready to come back swinging. It didn't knock anyone out in 1982, but it stepped into the ring, and soon enough, it would hit harder than anyone expected. Number 1, the 1984 Oldsmobile Hurst Olds, a car that tried to bring performance flair back to a fading muscle car era with bold styling and a wild shifter. Today's lecture focuses on the 1984 Oldsmobile Hurst Olds, A car that blended nostalgia, gimmickry, and just enough performance to turn heads in the early 1980s. It was Oldsmobile's last stand in the muscle car theater, an homage to the days when Hurst-badged Oldsmobiles ruled the drag strip. But in a decade defined by emission controls and downsizing, could a G-body coupe with a 307 V8 and a fancy shifter really bring the fire back? Let's explore how Olds tried, and how it fizzled out right after the curtain rose. Let's rewind a bit. The Hurst Olds partnership dates back to 1968, when Oldsmobile teamed up with Hurst Performance to create a special edition muscle car. It was the answer to GM's corporate ban on engines over 400 cubic inches in midsize cars. So instead of a 442, you got a 455 V8 stuffed into a Cutlass, thanks to Hurst's help. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, the Hurst Olds became a cult icon, known for Hurst badging, gold stripes, Hurst dual-gate shifters, serious muscle. But after 1975, it disappeared, along with the muscle car era. By the early 1980s, muscle cars were shadows of their former selves. Yet Oldsmobile, looking to rekindle performance excitement, decided to resurrect the Hurst Olds for the 15th anniversary of the original. Enter the 1983 and 1984 Hurst Olds. Visually, the 1984 Hurst Olds was a showstopper. Two-tone silver over black paint, inverted from the 1983 model, red and silver striping, fiberglass rear spoiler, dual chrome exhaust tips, special Hurst Olds badging. It rode on 15-inch chrome superstock 3 wheels with Goodyear Eagle GT tires, giving it an aggressive stance for the time. The 1984 model was technically a carryover from the 1983 relaunch, but it retained all the styling cues that made it stand out. Inside, you got red velour bucket seats, a full-gauge cluster, and most famously, the lightning rod shifter system. Under the hood, the 1984 Hurst Olds had a 5.0-liter, 307 cubic inch V8. Rated at 180 horsepower and 245 pound-feet of torque, mated to a 4-speed automatic transmission, 204R, with overdrive. By modern standards, or even late 60s standards, that output is underwhelming. But in the context of 1984, it was competitive with rivals like the Monte Carlo SS and Ford Mustang GT. 0 to 60 miles per hour took about 9 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the mid-16s. Not blistering, but quick enough to give the Hurst Olds some credibility among its peers. The car also had a 3.73 rear axle ratio, limited slip differential, firm suspension tuning, front and rear sway bars. The 1984 model was the final year of the Hurst Olds. Only 3,500 units were produced, down from 3,001 in 1983, making the total run 6,501 cars across 2 years. It sold well enough, but Oldsmobile was in transition. The Cutlass was evolving into a more conservative, comfort-oriented lineup. GM didn't see performance as part of the Olds brand going forward. So in 1985, the Hurst Olds was gone, replaced loosely by the 442, which returned in name but never recaptured the excitement of old. Today, the 1984 Hurst Olds has become something of a cult classic. It's remembered for being the last true Hurst-branded Oldsmobile. Its lightning rods, which collectors love or hate, its unique role in bridging classic muscle with 1980s style. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most powerful, but it tried to bring attitude and drama back to an era where most cars were beige boxes with vinyl roofs, and in that way it succeeded. The 1984 Oldsmobile Hurst Olds may not have rewritten the performance rulebook, but it did something arguably more important. It kept the memory alive. It gave enthusiasts a visual jolt, reminded them of the golden days, and let Oldsmobile leave the muscle car stage with some flair.